Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The sound was not music. It was an act of violence. A serrated bough dragged across strings with enough force to sever the very air in the room. Elias Thorne did not just hear the noise from the apartment next door. He felt it vibrating in the roots of his teeth. A chaotic, screeching cadenza that shattered his concentration and turned his pristine manuscript into worthless ink blots. For 3 weeks, the renowned conductor, known to the world as the Ice King of the Philharmonic, had been held hostage in his own sanctuary by a neighbor he had never seen but already loathed with a visceral, consuming intensity. Tonight, the invisible war would end, not with a noise complaint but with a sledgehammer. Elias stood in the center of his living room, a space of minimalistic perfection. The walls were painted a storm cloud gray, the furniture was sharp-edged Italian leather, and the grand piano in the corner gleamed like a polished obsidian coffin. He was a man of absolute control. His suits were tailored to the millimeter, his hair was always swept back in a severe, dark wave, and his conducting style was surgical. He did not tolerate mistakes. He did not tolerate disorder. And he certainly did not tolerate the auditory assault bleeding through the walls of the prestigious St. Jude Lofts. He had chosen this building for its reputation. Thick walls, discreet neighbors, and the silence required to compose his career-defining symphony. He had been blacklisted 3 years ago, a scandal involving a rival conductor who had framed him for plagiarism. This score was his redemption. It was his way back to the podium. But the phantom next door was destroying him. 2 a.m., the playing began again. It wasn't practice. Practice implied structure, scales, repetition. This was an exorcism. It was a violin being played by someone who wanted to break the instrument or themselves. It was frantic, dissonant, and terrifyingly brilliant. Elias marched to the adjoining wall. He didn't pound on it with his fist like a commoner. He picked up a heavy, leather-bound volume of Beethoven's sonatas and slammed it flat against the plaster. Thud. The violin screeched to a halt. Silence hung for 10 seconds. Then the violin answered. A sarcastic, mocking rendition of Pop Goes the Weasel, played with virtuosic speed, mimicking a taunting child. Elias's eye twitched. The sheer disrespect made his blood run hot, a sensation he rarely felt. He grabbed a ceramic vase, minimalist, white, expensive, and hurled it. Not at the wall, but at the floor, shattering it just to create a counternoise. The violin stopped. Then, a low, mournful note began to sustain. It grew louder, vibrating through the shared infrastructure. A perfect D minor that wept with such profound, gut-wrenching sorrow that Elias froze. The anger in his chest didn't vanish. It transmuted into something sharper, heavier. The player wasn't mocking him anymore. They were crying. Elias sank onto his piano bench, the silence of his own apartment suddenly feeling suffocating. Who was on the other side of that wall? The war continued for another week, but the weapons changed. Elias, realizing that brute force was futile against someone clearly unhinged, switched to psychological warfare. When the violin started its frenetic screeching at midnight, Elias would sit at his piano. He wouldn't play over the neighbor, he would correct him. If the neighbor played a chaotic, rushing arpeggio, Elias would play the resolving chord, firm and grounding. If the neighbor spiraled into atonal madness, Elias would force a melody into the gaps, a rigid, mathematical harmony that demanded order. It was a sonic duel. Chaos against control. Fire against ice. It was during a rainy Tuesday that the dynamic shifted. Elias was returning from a disastrous meeting with the symphony board. They had rejected his preliminary sketches, calling them technically perfect but emotionally dead. Emotionally dead. The words were acid in his veins. He stepped off the elevator onto the 4th floor, his umbrella dripping onto the marble. The hallway was dimly lit, the Art Deco sconces casting long shadows. And there, slumped against the door of apartment 4B, the source of his torment was a figure. It was a man. He looked like a fallen angel who had hit every branch on the way down. He was soaking wet, his white shirt translucent and clinging to a frame that was too thin. His hair was a shock of bleached silver, messy and grown out, plastered to his forehead. But it was the hands that drew Elias's attention. The stranger was clutching his left hand to his chest, his fingers trembling violently. Elias stopped, his polished Oxford shoes making a sharp click on the floor. The man looked up. His eyes were the color of burnt honey, wide and feverish. He looked young, perhaps mid-20s, but his expression carried the exhaustion of a century. "You," the stranger whispered, his voice raspy. "You're the piano." Elias stiffened. "And you are the nuisance." The man let out a wet, breathless laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. He squeezed his left hand tighter. Julian Vane. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Julian Vane. The prodigy. The Paganini of the 21st century. The boy who had set the classical world on fire at 16 and then vanished 2 years ago after a public breakdown on stage in Vienna. Rumors said drugs. Rumors said madness. Rumors said he had cut the tendons in his own hand. "Vane," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. "You're supposed to be in a sanatorium in Switzerland. And you're supposed to be conducting the London Philharmonic," Julian retorted, his teeth chattering. "But we're both here, aren't we? In the gutter." Julian tried to stand, but his knees buckled. Instinct, or perhaps the sheer reflex of protecting a valuable instrument, made Elias move. He surged forward, catching Julian before he hit the floor. Up close, Julian smelled like rain, cheap whiskey, and old rosin. He was burning up. "My hand," Julian gasped, pressing his face into the expensive wool of Elias's coat. "It's locking up. The cramps. They won't stop." Elias looked at the hand. It was a beautiful thing, scarred but elegant. The fingers curled into a painful claw. This was the hand that had produced the noise that haunted him. This was the hand that had mocked him. "You're having a dystonic spasm," Elias diagnosed coldly, though his grip on Julian was secure. "You've been overplaying. You're trying to force the music out through trauma." "I have to play," Julian whimpered, his arrogance dissolving into desperation. "If I stop, the noise in my head gets louder." Elias stared down at him. He should leave him here. This man was the embodiment of everything Elias detested. Chaos, lack of discipline, emotional volatility. "Get up," Elias commanded. He didn't shove Julian away. Instead, he hauled the violinist up, draped Julian's arm over his shoulder, and turned toward his own door, apartment 4A. "Where?" Julian mumbled. "My apartment is soundproofed better," Elias lied. "And I have ice." The interior of Elias's apartment was a stark contrast to the chaotic energy Julian exuded. Elias deposited Julian onto the pristine gray sofa. He moved efficiently, fetching a bowl of ice water and a thick towel. He knelt before Julian, ignoring the wet stains forming on his Italian leather. He took Julian's trembling hand. "This is going to hurt," Elias warned. "Good," Julian breathed, his head lolling back against the cushions. "I deserve it." Elias paused, looking at the sharp line of Julian's jaw. "Why? Because you vanished? Or because you're torturing your neighbors?" "Because I lost the music," Julian whispered, eyes closing. "I play and play, but it's just noise. I can't find the soul of it anymore. My mentor, he took it." Elias knew the story. Julian's mentor, a powerful conductor, had groomed him, used him, and then discarded him when Julian's mental health began to fracture. It was a story of power dynamics abused, a tale as old as the art form itself. "He didn't take it," Elias said, plunging Julian's hand into the ice water. Julian screamed, a ragged, raw sound. Elias didn't flinch. He held the hand submerged, his own fingers massaging the locked muscles with ruthless precision. He forced the tendons to release, working out the knots of tension that had built up over weeks of manic playing. "Breathe," Elias ordered. "In. Match my tempo." Julian gasped, tears leaking from his eyes. He focused on Elias's face, the sharp cheekbones behind the rimless glasses, the intense, dark eyes that watched him with clinical detachment yet profound focus. "Why are you helping me?" Julian asked through chattering teeth. "I drove you crazy. You hindered my work," Elias corrected. "But you are also Julian Vane, and allowing a talent like yours to rot in a hallway is an offense against art. I serve the music, Vane, even when the instrument is damaged." Elias pulled Julian's hand from the water and began to dry it with the towel, his movements gentler now. The spasm had passed. Julian's fingers were red and cold, but they were open. For a moment, neither moved. Elias was kneeling between Julian's spread legs, holding his hand like a holy relic. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the static electricity of two storms colliding. Julian leaned forward. The arrogance flickered back into his eyes, a ghost of his stage persona. "You have a beautiful piano, Elias. Do you play it with as much stick-up-your-ass rigidity as you speak?" Elias's eyes narrowed. "I play with precision. Something you've forgotten." "Precision is boring," Julian countered, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "Precision is safe. Play for me. Show me what the great Elias Thorne is working on." "It's not finished." "Neither am I." The challenge hung in the air. Elias stood up, brushing off his knees. He walked to the piano. He hadn't played the draft for anyone. It was his vulnerability, his exposed throat. But looking at Julian, broken, wet, and defiant on his couch, Elias felt a strange compulsion. He wanted to prove him wrong. He wanted to show him that control could be just as devastating as chaos. Elias began to play. It was a slow, brooding adagio. Dark, complex, and heavy. It sounded like the ocean at night, vast and threatening. He played with perfect technique, every note measured. But as he reached the bridge, he felt a presence at his shoulder. Julian had risen. "No," Julian murmured. He reached over Elias's shoulder and struck a high key. A dissonance. Elias stopped. "Do not touch my piano." "You're afraid of the fall," Julian whispered, his face inches from Elias's ear. "You're building a staircase, Elias. You need to jump." Julian didn't pull away. He sat on the bench next to Elias, ignoring the lack of space. Their thighs pressed together. Julian's damp clothes soaked into Elias's suit. "Play the bass line," Julian commanded softly. "Just the bass." Elias, bewildered by his own compliance, began the heavy, rolling chords of the left hand. Julian added the melody, but he didn't follow the sheet music. He improvised. He took Elias's rigid structure and poured gasoline on it. His fingers, limber now, danced over the high keys, weaving a counter-melody that was seductive, dangerous, and heartbreakingly beautiful. It was the conversation they had been having through the wall, but intimate. Elias felt his heart hammer against his ribs. This was it. This was the missing element. His music had been a fortress. Julian was the invasion it needed. The music swelled, louder and faster. Elias matched Julian's intensity, abandoning his sheet music, following the erratic, brilliant path Julian was cutting through the silence. They were sweating, breathing in sync, their shoulders colliding as their hands crossed over each other on the keys. It ended on a thunderous, unresolved chord that left the room ringing. They sat in the silence, chests heaving. Julian turned his head. His face was flushed, his eyes dilated. "See?" he whispered. "Not boring." Elias looked at him. The distaste was gone. In its place was a hunger that terrified him. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a wet strand of hair from Julian's forehead. "You are a chaotic mess, Julian. And you," Julian said, leaning into the touch, "are desperately in need of a mess." Elias kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It was like their music, a collision. Elias's hand gripped the back of Julian's neck, possessing him, grounding him. Julian made a sound in his throat, a desperate whimper, and clawed at Elias's shirt, pulling him closer, trying to merge their broken pieces into something whole. The weeks that followed were a blur of manuscript paper, coffee, and tangled sheets. The wall between 4A and 4B became irrelevant. Julian practically moved in. The dynamic of their relationship was a constant power struggle. In the bedroom, Elias was the conductor, dominant, demanding, exacting a response from Julian's body with the same focus he gave a symphony. He gave Julian the structure he craved, the safety of surrendering control to someone who wouldn't drop him. But at the piano, Julian was the master. He pushed Elias, taunted him, forced him to break his own rules. He took the red pen and slashed through Elias's safe measures, rewriting them in blood and fire. "It's risky," Elias argued one night, looking at the score for the final movement. "The board will hate it. It changes the time signature 3 times in one bar." "The board is dead," Julian mumbled, laying his head in Elias's lap as Elias worked. "Make them feel alive. Make them feel afraid." "Is that what you do?" Elias asked, running his fingers through Julian's silver hair. "Make people afraid? I make them look at the things they hide," Julian said softly. "Like you hid your passion behind your rules." The submission deadline for the symphony approached. Elias titled it The Wall. But the past has a way of echoing. 3 days before the submission, Elias came home to find the apartment silent. Too silent. "Julian." No answer. The piano was closed. On the kitchen counter lay a tablet open to a news article. Asterisk scandal returns. Disgraced prodigy Julian Vane spotted in city. Sources say he is unstable and dangerous. Asterisk it was a hit piece, orchestrated by Julian's old mentor. It detailed his breakdown, painted him as a drug addict, a liability. Elias ran to the bedroom. Empty. The closet. Empty. Julian had run. He had seen the article, felt the shame, and decided he was poison to Elias's recovering career. He had done the only thing he knew how to do, vanish to protect the music. Elias didn't call the police. He didn't call the hospitals. He knew where Julian would go. He went to the place where Julian felt most safe and most terrified. The old concert hall downtown. It was abandoned for renovations, a skeleton of a building. Elias found him on the dusty stage, sitting on a crate, his violin in his hands. He wasn't playing. He was just staring at the empty velvet seats. "Get up!" Elias's voice boomed through the acoustics of the hall. Julian flinched but didn't look back. "Go away, Elias. You can't be seen with me. The article. If they link us, your symphony is dead on arrival." "The symphony is you," Elias said, walking up the stairs to the stage. "There is no symphony without you. I wrote it for 2 voices." Julian shook his head. "I'm noise, Elias. I'm just static. You fixed your career. Don't let me ruin it again." "You didn't ruin me." Elias stood before him, casting a long shadow. "You woke me up. I can't play in front of them." Julian's voice cracked. "My hands. They'll lock up. They'll see me shake. They'll laugh." Elias knelt just as he had that first night. He took Julian's hands. They were cold. "They won't look at your hands," Elias said fiercely. "They will look at me. I will hold the room. I will hold the tempo. All you have to do is look at me. Just me. Forget the audience. Forget the critics. It's just the wall, Julian. It's just you and me and the wall." Julian looked up, tears streaking the dust on his face. "You're asking me to walk into the fire. I'm asking you to burn with me." The night of the gala was a spectacle of high society. Diamonds glittered, champagne flowed, and the air whispered with judgment. The board members sat in the front row, arms crossed, ready to dismiss Elias Thorne's comeback. When Elias walked onto the podium, the applause was polite, lukewarm. He looked impeccable, his face a mask of ice. He raised his baton. Silence fell. But he didn't start. He turned his head toward the wings. A murmur went through the crowd as a figure walked out. Julian Vane. He wasn't wearing a traditional tuxedo. He wore a black shirt, unbuttoned at the top, his silver hair stark against the darkness. Gasps rippled through the room. The pariah. The madman. Julian walked to the soloist's spot. He looked pale. His bow hand trembled slightly. He looked at the audience, and terror flashed in his eyes. He was about to bolt. Then Elias tapped the baton against the stand. Sharp. Authoritative. Julian's head snapped to Elias. Elias wasn't looking at the score. He was staring directly at Julian, his eyes burning with that possessive, intense demand. Look at me. Julian took a breath. He locked eyes with Elias. The crowd faded. The lights faded. It was just the gray living room. It was just the rain. Elias brought the baton down. The orchestra erupted. Not a gentle opening, but a violent, dissonant crash. The sound of a vase shattering. The sound of a book hitting a wall. Julian's violin soared out of the chaos. It wasn't the screeching noise of the past. It was a piercing, crying melody, refined by Elias's influence but fueled by Julian's pain. Cut through the hall like a laser. The interplay was mesmerizing. Elias conducted with a fervor no one had ever seen, his body moving with the music, driving the orchestra to support Julian's wild, flying solos. It was a battle. It was a lovemaking. It was a conversation between order and entropy. In the second movement, Julian's hand began to spasm. A ripple of panic crossed his face. He missed a note. Elias didn't slow down. He pushed the tempo, forcing the orchestra to swell, covering the mistake, turning the stumble into a syncopated rhythm. He smiled a rare, small smirk at Julian. I caught you. Julian saw it. His fear broke. He smiled back, a dazzling, dangerous grin. He recovered, diving back into the music with reckless abandon. When the final chord struck, that massive, unresolved D minor that dissolved into a whisper, the silence in the hall was absolute. For 10 seconds, no one moved. Then the audience erupted. Not polite applause, but a roar. A standing ovation. Julian lowered his bow, his chest heaving. He didn't bow to the audience. He turned and bowed to Elias. Elias stepped down from the podium. Breaking every protocol of the stage, he walked over to his soloist. He took Julian's face in his hands, right there in front of the board, the critics, and the cameras. You were loud, Elias whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You were controlling, Julian breathed back, his eyes shining. Perfect, Elias said. And as the flowers rained down on the stage, the Ice King and the noisemaker stood amidst the applause, finally hearing the only sound that mattered. The beating of two hearts that had found their rhythm. And that is how the conductor harmonized the chaos of the prodigy. If you enjoyed seeing Elias take absolute control to save Julian from himself, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments. Would you risk your entire career to save the person who used to be your worst enemy? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then.